Morning, everyone. So this week in worship, we are asking God's blessing on everyone going back to school this fall, or I guess I should say this summer. I don't know how long you have to live in Georgia before you get used to how early school starts here. But we are seeking God's comfort and guidance, not only for students from the smallest to the tallest, but for teachers and professors and parents and staff. And while we're at it, we could throw in God's blessing for all the students here at this church. For we have our Sunday morning Bible study, we have our reading groups, we are full of interns and volunteers who are teaching and learning constantly. One of the things I love most about this church is that we all teach and learn from each other. We have so many diverse perspectives and points of view, and we are constantly learning instead of just delegating that task to a few people. Well, with education on my mind this week, I was very much struck by this story of Jeremiah being called as a young man. Not just a young man, but before he is even born, God marked him out as a prophet. And what is at stake here is Jeremiah's vocation as a prophet to Israel, his mission in life. So this week I want to talk about the prophetic vocation with our dear friend Jeremiah. And then next week we are going to talk about the prophetic tradition using the book of Isaiah. So let's begin with the basics. What do we know about Jeremiah? Well, Jeremiah was a bullfrog. He was a good friend of mine. And I never understood a single word he said, but I helped him drink his wine, and he always had some mighty, mighty fine wine. Well, so if you got that joke, that's an old Three Dog Night song, and for our younger members, that was really big in the 70s. You'll learn about that in your history class on the late 1900s. I just feel older just making that joke. Okay, we're actually talking about Jeremiah the biblical prophet. Jeremiah the biblical prophet, and Jeremiah the book of prophetic writings, which is named after Jeremiah. And now most scholars believe that most of the text in Jeremiah the book does in fact date back to Jeremiah, a historical figure, with the exception of some pieces added by later editors and his scribe Baruch. Now Jeremiah lived in some of the darkest days of the nation of Israel. Technically the darkest days of the nation of Judah, because, brief history lesson, the nation founded by the Hebrews who fled into the Promised Land and created by David and Solomon, later splintered into a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. Whole bunch of maybe hundreds of years of basically bad kings later, you get that in Chronicles, and the northern kingdom gets conquered by Assyria. Fast forward 150 more years, and here we are in the southern kingdom, Jeremiah in Judah, and the forces of Babylon, the new empire of the day, are looming at the borders. And in Jeremiah's lifetime, they will invade, they will sack Jerusalem, and they will carry the leadership of the entire nation off into exile. So, what is important in our story is that Jeremiah is born into the last days of his old kingdom. Or maybe a better way of putting it is that he's born right on the cusp of something new. A moment of tremendous transition and change, a moment of upheaval. And it is at times like this, when everything seems to be changing quickly and we're going from one place to another, that we need these prophets to speak to us. And here we come around again to the prophetic vocation. For vocation is just a fancy word that means your work in life, your mission. Not the job that someone pays you to do, although it could be that. Not even the career you want as your goal. It's what you want to do with your time, what you want to do with the limited time we have here on this planet. The call that God places on your life, the work that God leads you to, the mission for yourself that you cannot get out of your head. That is the vocation that you have. And the vocation for a prophet is not, as some might think, to predict the future. The prophets in Bible times warn of upcoming consequences only because they are trying to comment on present circumstances. So they are commenting on the future as a way of talking about the present. Instead, the vocation of the prophet is threefold. They exist to give voice to hurts, to warn of consequences, and to imagine something better. Giving voice to hurts means speaking up for those who have been silenced, and that's why we hear in the prophetic writings some of the most beautiful calls for liberation, for dignity, for justice and peace. In the case of Jeremiah, what we have is someone giving voice to the trauma of an entire people. This entire nation that is about to be invaded, destroyed with tremendous violence. His nation is about to be besieged and countless people kidnapped into exile. In this case, trauma studies have helped us understand that what Jeremiah is doing is giving voice to the experiences of this entire nation and the generations that follow them, who are struggling to deal with this monumental and awful thing that just happened. All the hurt and the pain that this community suffered, all the hurt and pain that we might suffer, Jeremiah gives voice to it. And that's so important because Jeremiah, the book, can be massively difficult to read. I know a lot of people who start thumbing through the pages and are just like, nope. I'm good. It's confusing. It's jumping around chronologically all over the time. There's plenty of the sort of odd behavior that you get with a lot of prophets, which we can talk about some other Sunday. There's long stretches of poetry. There's the casual sexism and violence that you encounter in writings from this historical period. And we could even throw in some victim blaming for good measure. Most of all, it just seems like an angry book. Like if ancient Hebrew had text messages, Jeremiah would be the guy who only texted in all caps, like he's shouting all of the time, and he's so mad. Jeremiah has, in fact, been called a prophet of wrath. And on the first reading, you can get a picture of a pretty angry God, a God who's going to wreak destruction on people. And so at this point, you're thinking, okay, Colin, I'm on the side of the people who noped that book. Why are we talking about this? Can we go to a nice gospel and preach on that this Sunday? But I do want to suggest that there is some beauty to be found in all of this. And you don't have to find it. If reading Jeremiah is too much for where you are on your faith journey, that's okay. But there's beauty to be found in giving voice to deep suffering in this world that unfortunately is full of it. Kathleen O'Connor writes about what happened when she started applying this trauma lens to the book. She says, not only was Jeremiah more accessible and acceptable to the students, it also elicited from them their own stories of violence and trauma. It did more than give voice to the afflicted. It was and is a most effective instrument of survival and healing. The book's powers to lead toward rebirth of the shattered people of Judah lies in the very fire and brimstone that turned off many of my modern, ethically engaged students several years ago. So that's all to say that the difficult passages in a book like Jeremiah are difficult not because God is angry or violent, but because God created human beings with the freedom to be angry and violent. And because we so often choose that option, we have to find a way to give voice to the experiences that we go through and that path back to God. And giving voice to the consequences of anger and violence is part of the path toward healing. If we do not speak about our suffering, the things we have gone through, we let it linger. We let it consume us. We cannot escape it until we name it and share it and go on a path towards transformation. Now, the good news in all of this is that our God-given freedom to choose violence also means we have the freedom to choose a better path. And this is that prophetic vocation. Once again, we warn of these consequences because he's saying, hey, the road you're going on ends in a cliff. Y'all might want to turn. Much of what has been discussed or thought of as predictions are in fact these warnings of consequences. Prophets tell us that we need to change direction. And prophets give us something to dream about. They give voice to God's dream for this world, not the dreams of institutions and the powers that be that Jeremiah criticizes later in the text, not the dreams of wealth and money and status and power and like 3 million likes on Instagram, but the dream that God has for what this world would look like. And so prophets stand in this awkward gap between us and God, and sometimes their words sound harsh because they're trying to convey this infinite, unfolding, unpouring possibility of God in language that we can hear. Prophets not only deliver these dire warnings, they dare us to dream. They challenge us to ask why. Why is it that when we have enough food to feed everyone on this whole planet, some people go hungry? Why is it that when we have the technology to actually stop all of the climate chaos that we prayed for this morning, it continues? Why are so many so poor and so few so rich? Why do we glorify violence in our words and our actions instead of doing the work of peacemaking? We don't like dwelling on these questions. They're depressing questions. Prophets dare to ask them. They challenge us to ask why. They dare us to dream the way that God dreams. And that brings us back around to education. Because I want to suggest that the point of education is just this prophetic task. It is not to just churn out people who will keep running society the same way it has always been run. Its purpose is not just to get you a job that pays well. And just to be clear, rent keeps going up, so that's nothing to laugh at, but that's not the sole purpose of an education. The point of an education is to cultivate a sense of vocation and to instill a mindset that asks why whenever you see something that does not match up with the world as it could be. So, if you are going back to school this year, or if you know someone, if you're parenting someone, teaching someone who's going back to school this year, ask yourself this: how can I cultivate a sense of vocation? How can I help prepare this person, prepare myself for the holy task of giving voice to those who have been silenced, to the task of imagining something better? Perhaps you might ask, What can I do to use this time of learning to find what it is that makes my soul come alive? How can I listen to the quiet murmurings of my heart? What books can I read that maybe aren't on the syllabus but that are calling to me? What are the topics that aren't recommended by the career advisors but make my spirit sing? How can I encourage my students or my friends or my kids to listen to where the Spirit is leading them and to actually trust that voice instead of pushing it aside? How can we remind the people that we come in contact with that we learn stuff not to get the job later, but because we want to be lost in the joy of learning new things? The joy of finding the place that God set out for us. What can you do to make education not just one where you learn the system, but you learn how things have been done in the past so that you can make them better in the future? An education where you gain a set of tools that will allow you to go build something new. An education that asks, why are things the way they are, but does not accept every answer too quickly. That learns from different perspectives and different answers and allows your views to be challenged, but doesn't get you discouraged. An education that leaves you where you can see something broken and say, I don't accept that that's just the way it is and the way it always will be. I am going to be somebody who's dreaming of something better. And if this was important at Jeremiah's time, in that time of monumental shift and change, well, I have news for you. The way technology and culture are changing, the way our economic systems are changing, we are living through another shift, and those shifts are happening every day. So it has never been more important to cultivate this sense of prophetic vocation in every single person in the church, not just one or two set apart by God. God dreams of liberation and dignity and peace for all creation, and we are God's co-dreamers, God's co-imaginers, co-workers, co-students, co-teachers in this great work. That is a holy mission, and one that requires that we keep learning every day, no matter how old we are, in order to undertake it. But sometimes it means that we need to take a break, refresh our souls, and spend a little bit of time singing together. So now, let's sing.